Hey everyone, welcome to episode 4. Today's topic, the Sega Genesis, or as it was known in the rest of the world, the Mega Drive. It was Sega's answer to the successful NES, or Famicom as it was known in Japan, as well as the future planned SNES, or Super Famicom. We'll go over its history, specs, tear one down, and then we'll take a look. It was first released in Japan in 1988 as a successor to the Master System. The US got its release 1 year later. Sega initially developed the Mega Drive as it was struggling in the home video game market thanks to Nintendo's wildly successful Famicom, or NES, in the rest of the world. While the Master System was popular in Europe and parts of South America, North America and Asia just didn't seem to care much for it at the time. Sega also faced new competition from NEC with their PC Engine, or TurboGrafx 16 in the US. Now, Sega was a very successful arcade games manufacturer and developer, so it used its System 16 arcade technology as the basis for the Mega Drive. As mentioned earlier, it launched in Japan in 1988, and this was on October 29th. Unfortunately, Nintendo spoiled the release of the Mega Drive, as it had 1 week prior released Super Mario Bros. 3. However, it did eventually start selling units, though only 400,000 in its first year. Sega released a lot of games and accessories to try to get more sales, but the Famicom was just too popular and established. Sega then announced the North American release of the Genesis on January 9th, 1989. They didn't really have a way to distribute it, so they approached Atari. Atari declined, so Sega went it on their own. Nintendo attempted something similar with the NES, but that deal also fell through, so they too had to go at it alone. Anyway, on August 14th, Sega of America released the Genesis. Europe got theirs in September of 1990. Sega advertised the system as more powerful than the NES, plus it had a lot of the same arcade games many had played, such as Golden Axe. They also used the slogan, "Genesis does what Nintendon't." Over time, this became a widely popular phrase. They also released a large amount of sponsored games, mainly sports titles, such as Tommy Lasorda Baseball and Joe Montana Football. However, Sega still struggled to sell consoles, with only selling 500,000 in the first year. Around that time, Sega of America had a change of management, and they decided to fight Nintendo using a different approach. Whereas Nintendo was very picky and specific about who could make games, what games would be released, etc., Sega was a little bit more lax. Sega also developed games that would appeal more to the Western market, such as Sonic the Hedgehog, who was seen as cooler than Mario. This was Sega's big break in the US. Gamers waiting for the Super Nintendo to be released instead bought a Genesis. Not only did this help Sega retain lead through most of the 16-bit era, NEC dropped out of the North American market. Nintendo had to face real competition for the first time in years. Plus, Sega had signed on third parties such as EA, which made many successful games based on sports franchises. I mean, everybody knows Madden Football. Sega was the cooler console to own. It had blast processing, referencing the fact that its CPU was faster than the Super Nintendo's. It also had games Nintendo wasn't keen to approve. Nintendo was a family-friendly company, so Sega started marketing their console to teens and adults. One of the biggest upsets was with the release of Mortal Kombat. While the SNES version looked, sounded, and played better, the Genesis version had blood and all of the original fatalities, but only via a couple of secret codes that were conveniently leaked soon thereafter the release of the game. So while Super Nintendo gamers had to settle for sweat and severely censored fatalities, Genesis gamers got to have the full arcade experience, again, once you use one of these two codes. This, and other adult-like games such as Night Trap, caused an uproar among more conservative groups and eventually led Congress to hold hearings, requiring game companies to testify. This ultimately led to the creation of the ESRB, a games rating board similar to the MPAA, which rates motion pictures. Future violent games would retain their full gore and violence as a result, and be released on both systems, allowing Nintendo to regain some of the edge it had lost. So the Sega Genesis featured a Motorola 68,000-based processor running at 7.6 MHz. This CPU is similar to other 16-bit consoles and computers of the period. It also featured a Z80 processor, used as a sound controller to take load off of the CPU and to maintain backwards compatibility with Master System games. The Z80 controls the sound generation of the Genesis via the Yamaha YM2612, which was used to generate music, and the TI SN76489, used to generate sounds. Later revisions of the Genesis would utilize variations of the YM2612. It featured a stereo headphone jack on the front, which at the time was the only way to get stereo sound from the system, as the RF and AV outputs in the rear only produced mono sound. You could use this port to connect a 3.5mm to stereo RCA cable to your television, VCR, or surround sound system in order to get stereo sound. It originally came with a 3-button controller, though later releases of the Genesis would introduce a 6-button controller, mainly due to fighting games utilizing more than 3 buttons. Street Fighter II is a prime example of how frustrating a fighting game can be with only 3 buttons. Go ahead, I dare you. I dare you to play it with a 3-button controller. I'll wait. See what I mean? The Genesis also had add-ons available, such as the power-based converter, which allowed it to play Master System games, and the Sega CD, which allowed it to play games on CD with CD quality sound. Later in the life of the Genesis, Sega released the 32X, a 32-bit add-on that increased the power of the Genesis. This was mainly a stopgap while waiting to release the Sega Saturn, and was in response to Sony's announcement of the PlayStation. It didn't sell well. Another tactic Sega used to combat the PlayStation was to surprise release the Saturn well ahead of schedule, which just threw everyone off. Retailers didn't know what to do, gamers didn't know what to do. Let's just say that backfired. Maybe in the future I'll release a video discussing Sega's entire history. Let me know in the comments if that's something you'd like to see. Sega also had the Sega Channel, allowing you to download games from a cable TV provider. The games couldn't really be kept once logged out, and once the service was discontinued, they were seemingly lost forever. Hackers and other enthusiasts were able to save some of them, so at least they were preserved. Sega also developed the Sega Virtual Processor, or SVP, in response to Nintendo releasing the Super FX chip, which allowed Nintendo to release 3D-like games such as Star Fox or Stunt Race FX, as well as to assist in processing with games such as Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island. The SVP chip allowed Sega to port games such as Virtua Racing, a popular 3D arcade racing game. 2 other games were planned to be released, but they were instead ported to the 32X or the Saturn. There were variations of the Genesis, including the Genesis 2, a smaller, sleeker version, along with the matching Sega CD release. This model eliminated the front headphone jack, but added the ability to output stereo via the AV port in the back. Then there was the Genesis 3, an even smaller release, not compatible with the Sega CD or the 32X. Then there was the CDX, a portable CD player-sized console that was a combination of a Genesis and a Sega CD. Technically, it supported the 32X, but this was never officially advertised. There was also the Nomad, a portable Sega Genesis with a built-in screen that you can also connect to your television. Sega also licensed out the Mega Drive to various companies like JVC. Since Sega had no presence in Brazil, they also licensed out the Mega Drive to a company called TecToy, who would instead release the Mega Drive to the Brazilian market, as well as future revisions of the console. We'll talk a little bit more about TecToy later on in this video. Let's take this guy apart and take a look at it. I believe there's just 6 screws. There's nothing inside the Sega CD port. There's just standard Phillips screws. So if any of you want to do something similar, you should have no problem, because pretty much everyone has Phillips screwdriver, I'm sure. Gotta remove this top cover carefully, because I believe there's a cable to the LED. Yep, there it is right there. Oh, that's on there. Let's see. I don't want to actually pull on it, but the connector is pretty... Yeah, that's going to be tough to yank out of there, and I don't want to risk breaking it, but I've got to disconnect it so that I can open up the top. We now have access to the RF shield, which is what this is, and a lot of the electronics during the time, and even nowadays in some cases, will have this for 2 reasons. One is to keep any sort of radio interference that the system might be generating out, so it doesn't interfere with radios, televisions, and things like that. But it's also for the opposite reason, too, to keep interference out of the console. Find a repair manual. And this is the interior of the Sega Genesis. Otherwise, everything else looks okay on here. All the capacitors seem to be intact. They have not leaked. For those that don't know, a leaky capacitor is really, really bad for electronics, because the electrolytic fluid that's inside is corrosive to electronics and can't eat through traces. Traces are kind of like, for all intents and purposes,
they help complete circuits. They're like, I don't know. I mean, for non-techies, it would be like taking a wire from one component to another, except this is embedded on the circuit board. If you want to learn more about traces, just do a Google search. Like I said, I'm not an electrical engineer or anything, so I am not the go-to for that type of knowledge. But the electrolytic fluid can eat through traces, which will obviously cause disruptions in the way the system works. And that goes for any electronics. And electronics from this age, and definitely from the 80s, a lot of times the capacitors have started leaking already and starting wearing away the traces. You can, excuse me, you can sometimes repair the damage if it's not too bad. In the event that the trace has actually been completely wiped out, you can do what they call a bodge wire, which is taking a thin piece of wire and connecting from before the break to after the break. Or if you want to do it even, you do a better job, just run it from the original source. Let's say this pin here, and let's say the trace here is broken. You can run a bodge wire here, and it'll complete that circuit once again. Let's try taking out the screws in the cartridge slot. We're good. So, the underside of the board looks good too. A little dusty. Clean that off with some isopropyl alcohol, or IPA, as it might be known. There's a cracked piece of plastic in here. Just weird. It looks like it's from a CD-ROM drive or a CD disc of some sort. So it's possible someone's been in here already. Maybe they wanted to open up to check it out. Maybe they needed to make some repairs. I'm not sure. Another shield. And that's it. So, yeah, while I have this thing apart, I'll probably go and clean it. I won't put that on video because who wants to watch me wash things? I mean, kind of boring. So that'll be it for this. I'll clean it up, put it back together.
Let's briefly discuss the Genesis Mini, though a more in-depth review will probably come in a future video. It's basically a quarter-scale model and is even more detailed than the NES and SNES Classic. For example, the original Genesis had a headphone jack and volume slider, and the Mini includes these as well, although the headphone jack isn't really a headphone jack, and the volume slider doesn't really do anything. But still, it's a nice touch. Also, the flaps in the cartridge slot move too, but again, it's just for show since it doesn't actually use cartridges. And as with the NES, there were clones of the Genesis. Some were even official. For example, as I mentioned earlier, Sega didn't have any reach in Brazil, so they teamed up with TecToy to release the Genesis. TecToy really utilized their license and released several incarnations of the console. In fact, you can still buy a brand new Mega Drive in Brazil through TecToy. Then there's a company called AtGames. Jeez. They released several officially licensed Genesis consoles that utilize software emulation. They were not good at all. Compatibility was terrible. It was made from cheap materials, and the games that did work didn't work great at all. Sound was especially problematic. Now, to be fair, emulating the Genesis sound chip isn't a simple matter. But then again, a bunch of random developers on the internet released a bunch of emulators, and they sound pretty good, so what's going on at games? I even remember playing a few of these emulators back in the late 90s and early 2000s on my home PC. So not sure why some random people on the internet got it right, but an actual company, probably with many more resources available to it, screwed up so many times. Fortunately, Sega learned their lesson and released a Genesis Mini. All on their own. No involvement from AtGames whatsoever. Seriously, don't buy anything that says AtGames on it. You will have a bad experience. Okay, rant over. Sorry about that. Anyway, if you want to play your original game cartridges, if you saw my NES video, I'll post the link below, you'll know some companies have made clone consoles that can utilize cartridges. Ignoring the previously mentioned AtGames consoles, there are two good, reliable options available to you. One is the Analogue Mega SG, which is an FPGA-based system that pretty much nails it in terms of recreating the Sega Genesis. The other is the Hyperkin MegaRetroN HD. Hyperkin also makes systems to play multiple consoles, such as the Retron 5, which can play Genesis, SNES, NES, and a few others, but I'll only be focusing on the Genesis here. Note, none of these companies sponsored this video or this channel. This is just part of my own research that I'm conveying to you so you know what options are available. So as mentioned earlier, the Analogue Mega SG is an FPGA-based clone console that has almost perfect compatibility. So good that you can even connect it to your original Sega CD. Plus it will give you the best possible video output. Technically, it's also compatible with the 32X, but due to how the 32X displays video, it won't work out of the box. Analogue is said to be releasing an adapter that should allow you to make the proper connections in the future, so hopefully you'll be able to play your 32X library. And, like the original Genesis, it will also play your Master System games too, with the included adapter. Hyperkin's MegaRetroN HD appears to be a Genesis on a chip, but maintains really good compatibility. It also allows you to play your Genesis games on your modern HD TV with good image quality, though not as good as the Analogue. It also has regular audio-video outputs as well, so if you want to hook it up to your old CRT television, you can. It does not, however, allow you to connect your Sega CD or your 32X, but I think it will allow you to play your Master System games. I'm not sure, there seems to be conflicting reports out there. Both also appear to support most of the Genesis's accessories, save for the Menacer, which was their light gun. This will only work on CRTs, unfortunately. The Mega SG runs for around $190, while the MegaRetroN N HD runs for about $50. Which one you get depends on the kind of experience you want. Do you want the most premium possible solution to play your Genesis games, or do you just want something you can just plug in once in a while and have fun for a couple hours? There are other clone consoles available, but what was mentioned here is probably your best bet. And with that, here's the restored console. As shown before, it does have a little bit of wear and tear, but that's to be expected. I could probably find a replacement case online, but at this point I'm fine with it. It plays games just fine. I did pick up a brand new, officially licensed replica 6-button controller made by a company known as Retrobit. These guys partner with Sega to release the new controllers, not just for the Genesis, but the Genesis Mini and the Sega Saturn as well. The Genesis Mini controllers are USB, and as such will also work on your computer, smartphone with adapters, and the Nintendo Switch. They also release USB versions of the Saturn controllers with the same compatibility. They also work with the Genesis Mini as well. And I also picked up a Hyperkin Genesis to HDMI adapter. This allows for a much better picture on modern televisions than even using audio-video cables. By default, the Genesis uses an RF adapter, which combines audio and video and results in poor quality either way. Next up are the audio-video cables, the yellow, red, and white that you're probably used to seeing by now. This separates your audio and your video and gives you a little bit of a better picture. You can also perform an S-Video mod, which will clean up the picture even further, but most of us are not going to do that. The Genesis also supports RGB, which will give you the best picture quality possible without any other mods or things like that, but you need special equipment for that. However, the Hyperkin cable can take that RGB video output and convert it to HDMI so you can use it on your modern television. I should note that using this cable will add a little bit of extra lag, so if that's a thing that bothers you, you might want to look for other options. Just make sure that when you use this cable on your modern TV, that you turn on game mode, which should turn off most of the picture processing that the television does, which is what usually contributes to most of the lag people see when playing games. There's another cable that should be coming out soon that does something similar and apparently improves the image quality even further. Maybe I'll pick one up, we'll see. So that's about it. I will probably revisit this in the future if I can manage to find a working and not too expensive Sega CD. Though there is a new product known as the Mega SD, Mega referring to the Mega Drive and SD referring to an SD card. But anyway, it allows you to not only play Sega Genesis ROM files off of your SD card on your original hardware, it can also play Sega CD images as well. It is more expensive than finding a working Sega CD, but you no longer have to deal with scratched discs or any other mechanical failures that can happen with a Sega CD. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up and also feel free to subscribe if you haven't already. You can also hit the little bell icon so you get notified of new content as I release it. If you didn't like the video, hit the thumbs down, but please leave a comment below as to why so that I can make improvements in the future. Thanks all, and I'll catch you later.